One. Go team.
Go team. Amen. Hallelujah. Team Temple Aaron. Team Aaron. There we go. All right. As AC just said, thank you all for coming. Welcome. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you all with us. And whether you're here live on the screen, I wish it was live in person, personally.
Mm.
I prefer people to screens, but you got to do what you got to do. And if you're here at a later time viewing this, we're grateful for your just interest in what we're doing here. And of course, grand thank yous, multiple thank yous to Professor Thiessen, Matthew Thiessen, and it is Thiessen, correct? It's not Thiessen. I hear a lot of people saying Thiessen,
It's
but
Thiessen.
oh, darn.
Yeah, that's okay.
I heard a friend of yours say Thiessen.
Well, that friend is dead to me now.
Okay. Well, I was going to call you Tahiessen, so
Yeah, no, just Thiessen. The H is silent. But
all
it doesn't
right,
matter.
there
Just
you
call me,
go.
just call me Matt. I'm happy with
Okay.
Matt.
Call me
Yeah.
Matt. Not your holiness? Really? Come on. No, we're really thank you for your willingness to share your thoughts, your insights, your wisdom, and your time with us this evening. And I want everybody really to know here that we have a scholar, an author, a professor who has spent his life studying Paul, or at least his academic life studying Paul and Jesus. You'll give more of your bio in a moment, but we have a real opportunity to learn about one of the most important figures in history, certainly in the history of the Western world, and one of the most influential figures wherever you are on that sacred spectrum. He has influenced the Western life, the Western way of thinking, and we are just so grateful that we have a person who has an opportunity. We have the opportunity to learn from a person of great depth on this apostle named Paul or Saul or Shaul, whatever you want to call him, Paulus. You pick your name, but he's a great individual. And I also, just for you, Professor Matt, I've I've read your works and I appreciate your approach to the sacred in general and how you also wrestle with Paul and his various theologies, his approach to the sacred, his approach to life and holy living. You're not simply in a particular lane and it's my way or the highway. You engage with others, you do it with honor, and I'm looking forward to learning from you this evening. So if you want to give us, I can do it, or I'd rather have you give us a little bio, a brief background of who you are, how you came to this field, and some of your
Yeah,
important works, the works that
yeah.
you've done that I'd love to hear about.
I mean, yeah, thanks so much everybody for coming out tonight. And thanks for having me on and for your interest in stuff that, well, sometimes keeps me up at night, sometimes gets me up early in the morning. We could start all the way at the beginning. And I'll do it very briefly. I'm just a small town Canadian hick at the end of the day with no academic pedigree behind me. But I grew up in a very pious Mennonite family, actually. Um, and so was at church 3 times a week growing up. And, in my teenage years, didn't care so much at all, but got really interested in questions of faith and meaning and life when I got to university and quickly moved from science, where I was hoping to go and make a lot of money in medicine, to existential questions. And I really just got engaged in ancient Christian texts originally. And then very quickly, through a number of professors, realized uh, these texts that I grew up with, that I am quite familiar with on one level, I'll never be able to read them well if I don't think about them within their ancient Jewish context. Um, and so really got interested in thinking about Jesus, the Gospels, Paul as um, as first century Jewish texts and people. engaging with their fellow Jews around so many different questions. And so, that's sort of a quick, brief overview of where I come from. And it took no time at all to realize I just wanted to study these ancient texts, Jewish, Christian, and just really try to rebuild how I read very familiar texts um, in light of texts that were less familiar. So I just was talking about these texts I have my undergrads reading now, the Book of Jubilees and texts from Qumran and Fourth Maccabees and things like that. And I just couldn't get enough of learning about these texts in my early university education. Um, I would sit up at night reading through the pseudepigrapha and Qumran scrolls in translation initially, and became convinced that the way we think about the development of Christianity and what do we call the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, that we have still so much to learn here in ways that are not only accurate to history, more faithful to history, but also I think more beneficial to how Jews and Christians think about each other and interact today. So that's the brief overview. And I've written 4 books that sort of in different ways attack that or tackle that issue, I should say. I started on the topic and ritual of circumcision in my dissertation, uh, and questions around identity, Jewish identity, and how that relates to Gentile identity, and then applied that to the Apostle Paul in another book. Uh, then moved to Jesus. I wanted to get away from Paul for a while, uh, and thought about Jesus in relation to ritual purity systems and thinking. And then most recently turned back to Paul and thought, I think what I have said about Paul needs to be made more accessible to non-scholars. So wrote a little book called The Jewish Paul that uh, is right there. And I think it's pretty readable as far as any book on Paul goes. And it's my attempt to help make sense of Paul, not as an antagonist uh, of Judaism or an opponent of Judaism, but as one Jewish voice trying to figure out what it means to be Jewish in the first century world. And for Paul, that was in light of what he believed was the coming of the Messiah. So I don't want to go too far down that path, but that's me in a nutshell.
Oh, that's perfect, perfect. And again, just as a reminder for everybody, I often get lost in my thoughts and I look up to the heavens and I don't see your hands. So just feel free to call out anytime and say, somebody's not on mute. Uh, and just say, hey, got a question. And we'll go from there. Beautiful. So, and as far as your most recent book, and I'm sure a Jewish Paul, right, the Messiah's Herald to the Gentiles, that will echo somewhat your first book on Paul about Paul and the Gentile problems.
That's right.
Basically, there'll be echo there, the problems that we have with the Gentiles, which I want to explore. And uh, it'll be sort of I will go with wherever the spirit leads, so to speak, but I also have some focal points that I would like to highlight at least and begin. And your book here on a Jewish Paul, I think it was, what was it, in 2024? I think it came out somewhere around there. I could look it up. It's right.
2023.
Was it 2023? Okay.
Oh, that may be not. Yeah, I think that's right. 2023.
Okay, we're gonna
Yep.
we're gonna fact check you. 2023. All right,
Yes.
no fake
Good.
news here, folks. We got it. 2023. Yeah. No, and I was, well, how do I say without, I don't want to speak too much about myself in this area, but I was told to read this because I was giving a paper at one of the, the SBL AAR type, but events, and also in Europe. And I said, yes, of course. And it's a great book. It's a delightful book, first of all. It's an accessible book, as Matt said, and it's a very thoughtful work because you write in a way that engages. It's not just informational, it's also engaging. It engages the heart and the mind. And as I said, I appreciate how you wrestle with theological, moral, and scholarly questions. It's not just you have your approach. You wrestle with it in a way that's very beautiful. So what I'd like to do in the beginning, and we'll see where it leads us and where people's interests lie with their questions. But the first thing I'd like to do, I have a few questions here. One is there are different ways of reading Paul. We all understand that. And while the labels might be more modern, certainly in the last half century or so, your book focuses on reading Paul in your language in a more historically plausible way and a theologically fruitful way. That's your language, folks, not mine. And I appreciate the history, the focal point of that's your focal point history, but also the fruitful in terms of theology, because Paul wasn't just writing history. He had theology and the awareness of soul and heart and mind of those who he was writing to. So maybe you could walk us through first, who was Paul? We all know the basics, but give us as a person who is this is your life study.
Yeah.
Who was Paul the apostle before he was an apostle and then as an apostle one?
Mm.
And
Yep.
then who are the various Pauls that have blossomed or burst through various theological paradigms?
Yeah.
And then your this sort of recent paradigm of the Paul within or the radical new perspective on Paul, whatever we think of that terminology. Just
Yeah.
let's start from Paul when he
Yep.
was Saul, and then how did we come to these different theologies or approaches to Paul, and what's the newer version that you think is a more historically plausible and theologically fruitful Paul that we
Okay.
can all relate to as humans?
Yeah. A lot of Pauls. Um, so we do not know a lot about Paul before he was an apostle. The things he tells us, I mean, so if you know anything about Paul, it's often stuff we get from Acts of the Apostles, another New Testament text, which tells us about Paul. And scholars debate the historical value of some of that. What Paul tells us himself is that he was a Pharisee, uh, and that amongst other things, he excelled in the ancestral traditions, and he, whatever this means, persecuted the ecclesia of uh, Christ. So for some reason, he was opposed to this movement initially. That's about it that Paul tells us. Not a whole lot else. Well, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's an Israelite. He's a Hebrew born to Hebrews. So he tells us a few things about himself that are very
Don't forget about Snip Snip.
circumcised on the eighth day. Yes. Um, so he tells us these things about himself, but it's not a lot, right? You're not going to write a particularly interesting biography about him up to that point. I think what I'm going to do here, if you don't mind, is actually answer in relation to the question of other depictions of who Paul is,
Sure.
because partially it's related to the claim that he's a Pharisee.
Mm.
I imagine pretty much everybody here knows that Pharisee has become code in contemporary Christian circles, especially for bad guy,
Mm.
uh, on one level or another. Usually it means hypocritical, self-righteous, um, arrogant, things along that nature. And so in traditional Christian interpretation, when Paul says he's a Pharisee, that's entirely bad because that's the opposite of what you should be um, in much Christian discourse. And so when people say, oh, Paul was a Pharisee, but he became a Christian, this follower of Jesus, it's got to be the opposite of what we know Pharisees to be, all these bad things. And so, especially from the Protestant Reformation on, with Martin Luther and others, Pharisee and Jew was coded as somebody who thought they had to earn God's love, earn God's salvation. And so they would try to do everything in the law and would either convince themselves they had done it perfectly, which Martin Luther thought was completely absurd, or they knew that they hadn't, and they were filled with self-loathing and self-despair. And so there's this idea for Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and it's by far probably the most prevalent view within Christianity to this day, is that the Paul before Jesus, like all of Judaism before and after Jesus, is this religion of earning God's love. And the Paul that comes to believe in Jesus is the opposite of this. It's not earning in works or works righteousness, as it's often called. It's that there's faith in God's grace. And so there's this opposition between Judaism and Christianity, Paul the Pharisee and Paul the Christian, the law and the gospel. You have to earn God's love and salvation on the one side, the wrong side, or you are given it out of God's graciousness and love, and you access it through faith in Christ. So that's sort of the traditional and very, very common view of Paul versus Judaism, gospel versus law, Christianity versus Judaism. Really dominated the pulpit, Christian thinking, and New Testament scholarship on Paul. One of the most curious things, and I think it's, I'm always actually quite moved by it, is that there were Jewish scholars who decided they were going to study Paul. And I just think that's like, I'm moved. I really am. Who just said, we're going to study Paul and read him and give him the time of day, even though, he may say these awful things about us. Or at least he's getting used this way. And I think that really moved the dial in so many ways in the 20th century. Obviously, the show off also moved the dial to some degree, but at some point, certain New Testament scholars who were not Jewish, most of all, E.P. Sanders, who actually taught here at McMaster and published a book the year I was born called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And his whole effort was to say, you're reading Judaism wrong. Early Judaism was nothing like that. It totally believed in God's grace. God's election is fundamental to early Jewish thinking about the relationship between God and Israel. It's not a relationship of works righteousness, at least as Protestants sort of generally view it. And so he just argued very strongly that this traditional reading of Paul and Judaism has just got it totally wrong. He never gave a particularly clear, satisfying explanation of what Paul was doing with Judaism. I think it actually is better than people think it is, but he sort of left a bit of a vacuum. And out of that rose something called the New Perspective on Paul, which took Sanders and said, yes, Judaism was not this dead, legalistic, works righteousness religion. It didn't think that. But what was Paul's problem with Judaism? Oh, it was ethnocentric. And this developed in the early 80s into the 90s. Again, it still exists, but it's not as common. And there was this view of Paul. So as some of you may have heard of this scholar, N.T. Wright or Tom Wright. He's written large books, very large books. His argument was not that Paul preached against works righteousness. It was that Paul preached grace, not race, is the literal term he uses, word for word. And so his point was implicitly, Judaism preaches race, Paul preaches grace. And so between both the old sort of Lutheran perspective and this new perspective, there was this structural world set up where Paul saw something deficient within Judaism that was like integral to Judaism and rejected it, and therefore rejected Judaism. Now, what it was is the debate, but the clear structure is Paul opposed something in Judaism, rejected it for his gospel. And that's sort of where Paul scholarship has been since the 80s, between these two major camps. And only since really 2010-ish has there been a push to say that structural understanding of Paul and Judaism is fundamentally wrong. Uh, and we need to think about Paul within Judaism. So people were doing some of this before 2010, 2011, but it was in 2011, I believe, was the first year that at the major biblical studies conference, the Society of Biblical Literature, in Chicago that year, there was a huge session, and the title of it was Paul within Judaism. And since that time, there's been real sort of energy pushed by a good number of scholars, Jewish, Christian, neither, trying to read Paul as a first century Jew who doesn't reject Judaism, but is part of a larger, whirling, energetic conversation between first century Jews trying to figure out exactly what it means to be a good Jew. And that's sort of where I fall into place. I didn't know I was within this movement. I was doing some of this stuff sort of on my own and walking in the wilderness. And I stumbled upon this group and I thought, oh, we have a lot of stuff in common. Um, this sort of instinct to read Paul as a Jewish person of the first century, thinking about Jewish things, but in relation to non-Jews. I'm going to stop there because I think I went too long.
No, that was a brilliant summation of the world of Pauline studies. And that's what you will find in his work. And it's thank you for that. What I'd like to ask you a couple of questions
Yeah.
on this and then we'll progress. In on page 21 of your work and page 20, which precedes page 21, just offering deep thoughts there for the moment. Uh, you speak of how we come to understand Paul, and you quote some of the great scholars, Fredrickson and company, and it speaks of, as historians, this is Paul of Fredrickson, we conjure up, it's a disciplined act of imagination. I'll just start there. It's a disciplined act of imagination.
Mm.
And the question that I have for you first is, I believe that's Paul is brilliant,
Hmm.
as we all know, and lovely. The question is, how did something so beautiful, meaning the the message of Jesus and the early followers, how
Yeah.
did it turn to something so dark
Mm.
throughout history?
Yeah.
I don't, and I'll see where you go with that, and then I'll maybe follow it up. But it's one thing I have never understood, that if we're, and I asked this, I had something, it was very interesting. Years and years ago, I gave a teaching on the festival of, what do you call it in English? Booths,
Hmm.
Sukkot.
Hmm.
And afterwards, people were wanted to speak with me. And so I saw a person, he was standing outside the line next to it. And usually that means they're a former Jew, right? They're a
Mm.
Jew who became a Christian and they want to talk to me privately. And I asked him and he
Mm.
said, I'll wait. So I thought, okay, fine, let's talk. At the end, first thing he says to me, thank you. It was a very interesting conversation, teaching that you gave, but I have a problem with Jews. I said, okay, I can take that in one of two ways. He said, I said, you mean Jewish neighbors? You're having a problem? He said, no, with Jews. And I said, okay, now I have an opportunity to
Mm.
either walk away or engage. And I thought he
Mhm.
stayed to ask me and engage with me. And I thought there was potential. So it turns out he really doesn't like Jews for all of the reasons that Jews have been, mischaracterized throughout history. And he quoted biblical verses throughout from Paul and
Mhm.
the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so I asked him a question about in First John, where it says, if you say you love God and hate your brother, you're a liar. And you know what he
Mhm.
said to me? He said, you're not my brother. John wasn't speaking, he was speaking to Jesus' followers. He said, all right, I guess hatred really can turn a beautiful verse into something not so beautiful. So I said, fine, I'm not going to debate you on it. I think you're wrong. What about what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount about his enemies, that you're supposed to love them, and Jews are your
Mhm.
enemies? What about those who persecute you? Jews persecute you? How about you pray for us? For those who curse you, you're supposed to give us blessing. And to his credit, he said, I'll have to think about that. I don't know where he ultimately ended up, but what I'm asking is, how did something as beautiful as the New Testament wisdom turn
Yeah.
into something that was used in, as you say here, you speak of readings that harm others.
Yeah.
What happened there? What happened?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. That's that's powerful stuff. Um, and one of my initial instincts is I kind of want to get defensive. Um, and I also want to say, well, I want to just sit with that discomfort. And to me, it's painful. When I look at Christian history, to me, it's very painful. How Christians have traditionally treated enemies. How they first of all identify so many people as enemies and then don't love them. Um, I think so. I can talk about Paul here a little bit. Um, I think there's a weird alchemy that happens in readings of Paul's letters. When we take letters that are, well, they're letters, they're particular, they're specific, they're addressed to certain people in a specific time, they're not universal, but they become universalized. And so what Paul says about the law or this or that gets universalized about the Jewish law entirely. And I think that was a mistake, a sort of hermeneutical reading, theologizing error. Um, I am convinced that pretty much everything Paul says about the law or circumcision or any of these other things that he talks about need to be interpreted within the context of the first century, where Paul and his fellow Jesus followers are trying to figure out, what do we do with all these Gentiles who are joining our movement? Does the Jewish law apply to them? And how does it apply to them? And so Paul's claims about the law, I think, in general, are about they don't apply to Gentiles. Circumcision doesn't apply to Gentiles. It doesn't get them anything. He actually talks about circumcision being beneficial in Romans 3:1. What benefit is it to be circumcised or a Jew? Much in every way. What he doesn't think is that Gentiles getting circumcised is beneficial. Uh, and so there's sort of a category mistake. And so his polemic around these things isn't about the Jewish law in general, circumcision in general, or Judaism or Jews, but about the misuse, in his mind at least, of the Jewish law being applied to non-Jews. For him, these things don't apply. And when Gentiles want to pick them up, they're actually taking things that God never gave them. Sorry, my phone is apparently making noise.
I was calling you.
Oh, were you? uh, oh my goodness, it wasn't my phone, it's my computer. 1 second. I'm so sorry. Where's that coming from? I don't know. I'm
It's
sorry.
Paul.
I'm gonna ignore it, and hopefully it won't happen again. I lost my train of thought. The comments we see are not against Judaism per se. They're against the application of Jewish law to Gentiles. In later generations of believers in Jesus, most of whom were Gentile, started missing the ethnic particularity or specificity of those arguments. And so instead of saying, oh, Paul thinks circumcision of Gentiles is useless, they conclude, oh, Paul hates circumcision. Paul hates the Jewish law. Therefore, he hates Judaism and he hates Jews. And Jews, so there's actually 2024 piece by a religious studies scholar, Jewish religious studies scholar, writing on Paul, who understandably, to my mind, he's not a Paul scholar, but he understandably is like Paul's the father of anti-Semitism. He hates Jews. I don't blame him for saying that, because so much of the reception of Paul within Christianity is exactly that. Unfortunately, I just think that's the mistake is they've taken something particular and universalized it, and instead of realizing he's talking about Gentile law adoption, they take it to be against Judaism in general. And just a little piece here, in the Acts of the Apostles, um, a narrative written about the early Jesus movement that sort of the last half is on Paul. We actually get this reading of Paul in Acts 21, where Paul comes to Jerusalem. There are a whole bunch of Jewish believers in Jesus there, and they're described as there are a whole bunch of people here who believe in Jesus, and they're all deeply zealous for the law. And it's not characterized as a bad thing or a misunderstanding or anything. You can hold this together in Acts. And what they say to Paul is they're being told you're telling them not to circumcise their sons and not to keep the law of Moses. Show them that you are observant by doing these things, and then they'll know. And the whole point of this is that there's Paul's message is ethnically focused. He's an apostle, which means nothing to us. Uh, it's a term that's actually just a transliteration of a Greek word, but it probably is better translated as something as like herald, which I have in the subtitle of my book, or ambassador, or something along those lines, envoy. An ambassador isn't generally an ambassador to the entire world. They're an ambassador to one specific people. And I think that's exactly what Paul is. He's an ambassador to non-Jews on behalf of the Jewish Messiah in his mind. And so what he says, we always have to keep saying, wait a minute, this isn't universally applicable. In the first instance, this is towards Gentiles. And maybe only after we get that can we talk about something like, what's the universal message here of Paul? And I think there's a fundamental mistake that was made pretty early on in reading Paul that's just been going on now for 2,000 years. And of course, none of these readings happen in a vacuum. So I don't want to just talk about it as like a scholarly thing. We've got communities of people in the early centuries of this era who are in debate about how to read the Bible, are in debate over, well, is this guy the Messiah or not the Messiah? And so there's real live, true, important debates happening. And part of that becomes like this very rhetorically charged condemnation. And they can pick up texts in Paul and apply them this way. So that would be my explanation for how at least Paul gets taken in this way.
Yeah.
I honestly think he'd be mortified. I think he'd be mortified to see this.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on I said on a podcast not too long ago that he would be same idea, horrified. And I said I made a little bit of an attempt at humor that I don't think Jesus would turn the other cheek at some of the treatment that his followers have done in his name. And I meant no, I didn't want by bringing this up. We all have skeletons in our historical religious histories. I meant nothing by that, and I apologize if for the potential defensiveness. I have the similar struggles with my own religious history. Paul is, as you quote, and everybody quotes in Second Peter. You know, I call it the other great 3:16, chapter 3 verse 16 chapter, because in Second Peter chapter 3 verse 16, you know, Paul is difficult to understand, and fools like us, and not literally, but they misunderstand him and twist his message. And then there's the John 3:16, right?
Yeah.
He is difficult, but he's also brilliant. And I wonder if we could go through a few passages, because here, now all the cards on the table. We didn't have enough time to talk beforehand. I don't claim to be a scholar, although I speak at some of. Were you at, by the way, the Society of Biblical Literature conference for the Paul within Judaism session where they were discussing difficult texts, problematic passages?
Which year was it?
Oh, sorry,
They've been
that's a
doing
good
that for a
point.
few
Yeah.
years. Yeah.
2024 in San Diego. I don't think so.
No, I
And
wasn't. No.
yeah, all right. So we'll talk after. But
Yeah.
all cards on the table. I in my heart, deeply in my heart and in my mind, am so sympathetic and grateful for this necessary corrective of Paul within Judaism
Mhm.
that I think is helping to really bring the light of Paul out of some of
Mhm.
Luther's darkness.
Yep.
Okay. However, I do struggle, not because I'm a rabbi, but theologically, I will talk later. I
Yeah.
struggle with the prepositional, the preposition within.
Yeah.
I think the parameters
Sure.
of that defining of that prepositional phrase within Judaism,
Yeah.
I think if you expand it enough, everything can be within Judaism. But that I just wanted you to know up front, some of these questions are coming from that
Sure.
place, but in my heart, I wish it were true
Yeah.
because history would have been so rich for our what I don't even think it would have been a parting of the ways. It would have been parallel ways of
Yeah.
serving and loving and living together. It would have been so beautiful. And we can do this. And people like you and this movement of Paul within Judaism and good Christians across the spectrum are living the light and the love of Jesus and and also what Paul preached in the name of Jesus. So my question, if we could go through a couple of verses to
Yeah.
see how, not a debate, I'm
Yep.
trying to understand they misused them, and these were bright minds. These were church
Yep.
fathers. They were the gifted minds of the history of the Christian faith.
Yep.
I don't see Paul defining himself within, which is irrelevant because Paul still loved his people. But
Yeah.
what are some, let's go through a couple of passages
Sure.
maybe, just to
Yep.
help us see here
Totally.
is what sounds like a very dark passage. And then you can give us a way of reading because that's that imagination
Yep.
that Paula was speaking of
Yeah.
uh, and giving Paul that benefit of the doubt that he came from a place of love, like in Romans 9, he would have given up his eternal salvation for his Jewish brothers and sisters. Okay, he loved his people. So I'm just curious, you emphasize it's going on the Gentiles. Much of
Yep.
his, and I agree with you, he is often speaking to the Gentiles. My question, you mentioned Romans 2. He seems, well, we only have a few minutes. So let's just start with
Yeah.
Romans 7, if you
Okay.
all have your texts out.
Yeah.
He speaks there in the beginning about, he's speaking to those who know the law. Now, it might be knowledgeable Gentiles,
Yep.
but we can debate that. But then when we get to verses basically 4 through 11, there's a few verses here that sound like Paul is including himself in
Yeah.
this release from the law because he uses the personal pronouns, personal pronoun we. And
Yeah.
so just help us when it says, likewise, my brothers and sisters, you also have died. My brothers, you also, okay, have died to the law through the body of Christ. So it sounds like he's including himself, one, but then he adds, why did you die to the law? So that you may belong to another. That sounds like he's including himself, to him who has been raised from the dead. Why? In order that we may bear fruit for God. Because he then discusses the law and it arouses, sinful passions. But we were held captive by the law. So therefore, we had to be released from it, and we serve in a new way. There's plenty of verses like this
Yep.
in his writings, and what I've never really heard acknowledging his love for his people, absolutely. But it sounds to me like when he uses "we were released,"
Yep.
or you know all the verses for another discussion. How do we say he's only writing to Gentiles when it sounds like he's including himself? And I think this message is also for the Jews. Or else,
Yeah.
why would he give up his own salvation so the Jews could come to Christ?
Yeah. Great. So there are some things that I find maybe a little easier to answer, and some things I
Good.
don't know that I have comfortable answers for yet. There's still stuff I struggle with here. Um, when I say he's writing for Gentiles, predominantly, that means the rhetorical shape of his arguments are directed at them. That does not necessarily mean that nothing he says has applicability in his mind for himself or his fellow Jews. I think, for instance, Paul is uh, what one scholar calls an anthropological pessimist, which is a lot of syllables to say Paul thinks humans are fundamentally incapable of living well because he has a very negative view of the flesh, quite literally the flesh. Um, he thinks the flesh is subject to powers of death and sin that it can't itself overcome. Um, Now, I think he's particularly negative about Gentiles, but he doesn't think the law is enough power, gives enough power for flesh and blood humans to overcome their flesh and bloodness. And so, uh, which is not necessarily a criticism of the law per se. Is that its goal? Or is it something to constrain flesh and blood? So this is, I think, this is maybe a little off, a little bit of a tangent. Ritual purity is a great example. There are ritual purity laws that deal with flesh and blood bodies. Maybe the ideal is to someday not be constrained by mortality, so that not that ritual purity doesn't matter, it's that the body has transcended it. It's no longer able to become ritually impure. And I think that goes with morality and sin. Paul's vision is humans, both Jew and Gentile, but maybe particularly Gentiles, are subject to the powers of sin because of how they're constituted. And one of the goals is to transcend that. And the law doesn't make that happen. And maybe was never intended to make that happen. The Messiah does in his mind. So it's not that the law is bad, it's just limited in what it can
Mhm.
actually achieve. And it's limited, as Paul says in Romans 8, and he shows in Romans 7, by the flesh.
Yeah.
Sin resides in the flesh. If that's where sin resides, good luck with a law being applied. You need something else to reside inside, which of course is kind of like Jeremiah and other prophets. You need the covenant internally, um, not because it gives you a different morality, it just gives you the power to live morally. So, Christine Hayes, who's a fantastic scholar of
Yeah.
early Judaism, talks about um, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then Paul within this world of what she calls robo righteousness, that God gives his spirit, which gives moral power that is inaccessible anywhere else. And I think that's part of what's going on in Romans 7.
Do you think we're going to go to questions in a
Yeah.
moment?
Yep.
In the chat, I just want just to round out this
Yeah.
part of the discussion regarding the flesh. A couple of things. One, do you think that Paul's view of the flesh applies to both Jew and Gentile? And do you think his thoughts are within the, we'll just leave it, well, biblical and Second Temple
Yeah.
expression of
Yeah.
Judaism?
Yeah. I think Paul thinks Jews have an advantage.
Hmm.
Um, in part because they've had the law their whole lives. They've had access to what God wants, and they've been shaped by some of it in ways that Gentiles haven't been. Um, they've had a better upbringing in a sense. So they have maybe a natural ability or I can't think of the word here, but their inclination is maybe a little more natural to go that way. Doesn't make them perfect, but it makes it maybe a little easier, a little less resistance. But there's still so much more in Paul's mind that they can achieve, both Jews and Gentiles. Now, Paul thinks Gentiles are idolatrous and totally given over to immorality. He doesn't talk about Jews this way at all. Um, it's Gentiles who are. In Romans 1 talks about, I think it's the Gentile condition. It's the Gentile problem. They worship the wrong gods, and because of that, they're totally misshaped in their desires. Jews at least worship the right God and are conditioned by that to some degree. Both can still be elevated. Just the Gentiles have so much more room. I
Okay.
think.
Okay. Can Torah
Yeah.
Torah? I happen to lean in the anthropological pessimism. I lean
Yeah.
into that.
Yeah.
I think he has a viewpoint of humanity, of fleshly humanity,
Yeah.
that I think is not. I don't want to say it's not Jewish because he's Jewish, but I think it's a minority view at best.
Fair enough.
Um, because we're told the first time sin is mentioned in the Bible, the
Yep.
Hebrew Bible, which is both of our Bibles, it speaks of
Yep.
in Genesis 3 that sin is
Right.
crouching at the door. It's not
Crouching.
permeating your heart, but then
Yeah.
it says, Va'ata, its desire is towards you.
Yeah.
But Va'ata tim shalbo, but you, doubled,
Yeah.
can rule over it or
That's
master
right.
it of some
Yep.
form. So it's the potential, not you will, but
Yeah.
can Torah
Yeah.
for Jews
Yeah.
help us? The law of the Lord is perfect,
Yep.
restoring the soul.
Yep.
Or are we simply both, Jews and Gentiles, maybe Gentiles a little more in Paul's mind,
Yeah.
just terribly subject to the flesh? But for Jews, maybe the law can, because I don't understand the idea of dying to the law or being
Yep.
released from the law.
Yeah.
That's
It's
where
great.
I miss it, because I think he means that for all,
Yeah.
even though he loves the law.
I mean, yeah. So Romans 7, this text that we were just in, he talks about the law as holy and good. He
After
doesn't have,
it promised life, but proved to be death.
yeah, it's not, but it's not a criticism of the law per se. It's holy and it's good.
Okay.
I'm not. And so a holy good thing, just the tension builds because if you know it, it just sets up that tension that much more so. Let me just go back quickly. I don't want to lose this
Yes.
point, Joe, because I think
Sorry.
it's really good. No, not at all. Um, oh, I forget how you worded it. Is it biblical and is it Jewish? This pessimism. I forget if that's exactly
Yeah.
how you worded it.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
thing where Paul looks most similar to like other early Jews is actually Qumran.
Yes.
Um, there are
Yes.
texts there. Uh, there's a great book by scholar Nicholas Meyer on the Hodayot at Qumran, and they really dial in to the fact that the human is like constitutively made of crap. And because of that, we're so prone to sin. And we need to transcend that. Um, Now, I don't think most of Jewish tradition argues that. I can think of rabbinic texts that talk about we're made from the earth and we're made from heaven, and there's two things. That's not quite what like Qumran isn't this. It's just all you're made of this stuff down here. And so Paul's very similar to at least certain texts from Qumran, but you're right, it's a minority voice. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we will look. I'm gonna beg and bribe and everything to have you back. But
yeah,
lunch. But the last question, and then we go to AC. You'll read all the chats that we have time for. Beautiful. My question, one other question. And again, your book discusses this very, very beautifully. My question about conversion.
yeah,
Paul, at least in your understanding and in his understanding, your understanding of Paul and Paul's understanding of Paul, it doesn't seem like conversion is, I mean, not even the best option, but an option. It's Christ died in vain if
yeah,
righteousness is through the law, if we have to
yep,
keep the law. My question for you is, that seems to be also certainly not the mainstream view of Judaism biblically, because we have converts. Abraham was a convert, and he roots the Gentiles in Abraham, who was a convert who became a Jew. We have many converts in the Bible. Judaism, the Second Temple period, had converts.
Yeah.
Rabbinic Judaism has converts. What's Paul's issue with Jew, and why is circumcision of no value? What's wrong with it's a holy act, as he says, the law is holy. Why isn't it holy, just not necessary?
Yeah. Whew, there's a lot there.
In 30
There
seconds.
are
No, just
there are other early Jews who don't think conversion's possible. The Book of Jubilees, for instance, is I think quite clear on this. And I
right.
don't think like Genesis views it as conversion. Abraham becomes a model of it, though. You're right. Paul has to handle that. And one of the things he stresses is before Abraham's circumcised, he believes God, Genesis 15:6, believes God, and it's credited to him for righteousness. And so Paul's trying to say, well, that circumcision, okay, it happened fine, but it didn't have anything to do with his standing before God. That happened in 2 chapters earlier.
Right.
That's how he runs with it. And I think he's trying to. So this is also this is a little bit in conflict with what I just said, though. So I'm acknowledging that. For Paul, Jews, like himself, keep the law, and they add, in his mind, they add the Messiah.
Hmm.
With Gentiles, it's a very different situation. If Gentiles come to the Messiah and then add the law, what they've done is said, the Messiah is insufficient.
Hmm.
And what the Messiah can't do, the law finishes. Whereas Jews who believe, or Jews who keep the law and then add Messiah, aren't saying the Messiah is insufficient. And I think that's part of what's going on there.
Okay.
It's a different situation. Now, I think Paul really does think this movement can't work if Jews don't stay Jews and Gentiles don't stay Gentiles. Now it becomes untenable in Christianity because how do you keep these people in close proximity? If one group has to be Gentile, can't keep most of the Jewish law, and one group has to stay Jewish and has to keep the Jewish law. How does that work at like meals, weddings? Who can you marry? Can you marry anybody in the group? So it becomes very complicated, which I think is part of why it unravels
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. We'll go to some questions, and then I will have you leave us with, if you can, I'll give you a few minutes to think on
Yep.
the Apostle Paul's vision for us, and if we could root that in a text. Just here is a glorious text that expresses one radiant aspect of his light and his wisdom and his insight. Just to leave it on, here really is Paul, and I think Paul would say that really is me. Forget those challenging texts we all have. Yes, I'm difficult to understand, but here is a vision of Paul that we can all leave with and live with and love better with. So, AC, you want to read a few questions, and
Sure.
Matt will answer.
Yeah, so this may have been addressed. What was missing in Judaism that Paul found and couldn't get past?
Yeah, so that's I think the problem. That's not
Right.
what Paul's thinking is. That's the traditional ways of reading Paul.
Hmm.
Paul isn't living his life thinking, man, this isn't really working very well. The way he talks about himself before Jesus is, I was excelling. I was doing a great job. If anybody had a reason to boast, it was me. And then God just rudely interrupted me and said, oh, here's the Messiah. That's Paul's view. So he doesn't think there's anything wrong with Judaism. He just thinks, wait a minute, the Messiah's here now. And so that's for Paul the turning point. The Messiah that we've all been waiting for is here. That's what he believes. Some other Jews don't believe it. Some other Jews do in his day. But it's not a thing like there's something structurally absent, missing with Judaism that needs to be fixed. And his gospel does it. I don't think that's what Paul was thinking.
Okay, next question. How much of the account of Paul in Acts can be considered trustworthy when it comes to Paul's thinking and biography?
I don't know. As a scholar, as a scholar, I'm very skeptical about any sort of ancient history or ancient histories. What I find so interesting, though, is its description of Paul in relation to Judaism is exactly counter to how most Christians have ever understood Paul. And so that's to me shocking. Here's a canonical Christian text that introduces, it happens before we get to Paul's letters. We read Acts. We read Acts. He's a faithful Jew. He keeps the law. He's never sinned against the temple or the people of Israel. And then all of Christian history is the exact opposite of what Acts claims Paul is. So I'm not sure about the historicity. I just think it's the interpretive key that Christians are canonically supposed to use to unlock the very difficult to understand guy named Paul. So I didn't answer your question. I don't know.
Yeah. How much of the debate of Messiah in Paul's times was between Jews as opposed to Jews and Gentiles?
Yeah. The Messiah is a Jewish category. Non-Jews who weren't associated with Judaism, who didn't know other Jews, weren't waiting around for a Messiah. That's totally Jewish language in antiquity. It's a Jewish debate. And the debate about is this guy Israel's Messiah or isn't he is a total internal Jewish debate. Gentiles in synagogues, God-fearers, whatever you want to call them, maybe we're participating in those, but at the fringes of that conversation. So you're right, it's a total Jewish debate initially. Then you got to go out in the world and tell people, hey, you don't know anything about a Jewish Messiah. Let me tell you about this Messiah Jews are waiting for. We got him now. And he should matter to you non-Jews. So I'm going to stop there, cognizant of time.
Yeah, that kind of connects with another question about would Jews be considered Gentiles if they left the Jewish faith, and
Yeah.
are they leaving it in those days if they
Yeah.
think that Jesus is Messiah?
Awesome. Paul never uses the term Christianity. He never uses the term Christian. Either he doesn't know it or he doesn't like it. There's no Christianity to which you can leave Judaism. Paul still thinks he's a Jew. Other Jews maybe disagreed, although I'm a little less certain that the ability to think of somebody who's a Jew no longer being a Jew. I think the better categories are you're a good Jew, a bad Jew, a faithful Jew, an unfaithful Jew. And there were people who thought Paul was a bad Jew, for sure. But I don't think Paul thought he was leaving Judaism, and I'm not sure anybody else thought he was. They maybe thought he was a bad Jew and identified the wrong guy as the Messiah, but not that he was no longer Jewish.
Here's another one. How does divine election fit into the difference between Jew and Gentile in Paul's view?
Paul thinks Jews have been elect. They've had this election, and it's non-debatable. This is the non-controversial thing for Paul and other Jesus followers. What's controversial is the status of non-Jews in relation to Israel's God. So the difference there is who are Gentiles in relation to Israel and Israel's God? How do they get to where they need to be? And that's what early Jesus followers are debating. Some think Gentiles need to keep the law, essentially becoming Jews, and then they are part of the elect. For Paul, Gentiles are part of the elect through the Messiah, unrelated to the Jewish law. But nobody's debating are Jews elect or non-elect in Paul's day, at least amongst Paul and his fellow Jesus followers. That's something that happens later in Christianity, right? Are Jews elect or are they now damned? Paul's not debating that. He's debating Gentiles in their election.
Some other questions along those lines. Do you want to cut in though, Rabbi Joe, or do you want to pick up another
No,
thread?
let's go.
Keep going?
One
Okay.
more question, maybe, Matt? You got
Yeah, this I'm just reading it for the first time, so it's packed. Paul speaks of his mission or ambassadorship to Gentiles as a divine calling, and Acts depicts his call in a dramatic moment that it has Paul recount multiple times. But why do the Gentiles matter to Paul? Why, if he so desires Israel's vindication and redemption from exile, that he would forfeit his place in Olam Haba, the world to come, to save Israel? Does he care so much about non-Jews, especially when he holds such a pessimistic view of them?
Yeah, that's Brandon. Brandon, I think I recognize you from SBL conferences in the past, right?
He's weighing
Um, so I think Paul's convinced he's divinely ordained by Israel's God on behalf of Israel's Messiah to go tell this good news to non-Jews. But that doesn't, so he's the ambassador. Any ambassador may have a mission to a foreign country, but their fidelity is to their own people, their own nation. And I think that's exactly what Paul's doing. And so even as he goes to non-Jews, in Romans 9 through 11 is actually, it's actually really comical in a way. He's trying to get his fellow Jews who don't believe in Jesus to be jealous. And how does he do that? By all the attention he gives to non-Jews. I think it's like bad high school romance, where you flirt with someone to make your boyfriend or girlfriend jealous. That's what Paul's trying to do. Even his mission to Gentiles has sort of an ulterior motive in that he's trying to do something for his own people. Um, yeah.
Got one more, AC? I can't hear you, AC. You're on mute.
That was a rookie mistake. There's some other comments. I was not questions that I see. I was curious. This is a tumultuous time. It's post destruction of the temple, the upsetting of the kingdom, and Jews being hurled out into the from the homeland, and how much of that was playing a role in all of this as well.
Yeah. So Paul dies before the destruction of the temple. But that doesn't mean it's not tumultuous. It is still. We've had Jews probably kicked out of Rome, uh, and then returning. And there are tensions, as actually Martin Goodman has a beautiful book on this, in relation to Rome and Judea. Uh, there are tensions because these are pagan rulers who are dominating the Jews. And so when Paul is going to non-Jews and convincing them, this is what Paula Fredrickson, who is absolutely brilliant, she's absolutely right about this. And you have to sort of think about realities, like real flesh and blood bodies in relationships. He's calling these Gentiles, come worship Israel's God, follow Israel's Messiah, read Jewish scriptures. You're taking on a fundamentally Jewish world. No wonder some of them are like, well, I've done all this. Why not go get circumcised? Throw in a little Sabbath observance. Stop eating pork. You're already mostly there. um, and then Paul is like, no, time out. Stop right there. You can't be Jews. It's so like jarring, I think. And Gentiles would understandably be so confused. You want us to Judaize up to a certain point, but then no more.
Mhm.
And then we're always in sort of like quite frankly, you're in a secondary status. You're never Jewish enough, and you can't be. And so I think that places them in an awkward position vis-a-vis their Jewish fellow believers in Jesus, but even more so in relation to their non-Jewish families, friends, social groups who are like, wait a minute, you stopped worshiping our family gods, but you're still like here in this weird no man's land of not Jewish, but kind of Jewish, not pagan, but a little bit pagan. Um, and so I think this is part of what's happening. There's just confusion, and it leads to a little bit of social tension, between Gentile believers in Jesus and Gentile pagans.
Beautiful. So this, I think, is I'd love to continue, but I want to respect everybody's time. And thank you again, Matt, for really spending not only your time, but sharing your life's work, your life's wisdom, and the richness of Paul with us. And could you leave us with something from Paul as human beings?
Yeah.
There's neither Jew
Uh,
nor Greek here. Give
yeah.
us some light of Paul that just we can all say amen, bow to, and live better because Paul is a profoundly rich thinker,
Yep.
and I'm sorry he's not here. I've said before, if Paul and I were in the same city, he would be at my Sabbath table
Uh-huh.
regularly so that I
Yeah.
could learn from him.
Yeah.
So share some Pauline beauty with us, and then we'll call it a night.
Yeah, it's tough to let me give you one thing. In the letter to the Galatians, Paul says to his Gentile readers that the only thing that counts is faith working through love.
Yeah.
Uh, and our faith in our God has to be expressed in our love for God, but also our love for each other. Um, and we may want to debate, as Joe mentioned, who our neighbor is,
No, that
who
wasn't
our
my
brother.
debate. That was his.
No, sorry, that's what I mean. Some of it may be tempting to want to constrict who we are required to love, but I think our love has to be expansive. Um, and actually, it shouldn't doesn't have to be. It gets to be. We get to love beyond all boundaries, and that to me is so encouraging.
Yeah, that's one. If we were to take just if we had instead of 10 commandments, 10 top wisdom statements
Mm,
from across the sacred spectrum, that's got to be near the top.
yeah,
Because if your faith, if without love, your faith isn't working.
yeah,
Okay. And Jesus certainly highlighted a very Jewish and Paul, a very Jewish construct or notion or concept of love that in my opinion did get somewhat lost in the
mm,
legal observance. It can happen, we know that, but it was always a love-based religion, and sometimes like all human beings we lose the love that is there and that is available. That is, you couldn't have ended with a better message for us all, that faith working through love. Your faith don't work through love. There your faith is dead. Okay, to quote James, faith without
mm,
love is dead. How's that?
yeah,
Thank you. Stay on for a second, Matt, after I just
sure,
want to ask you a quick question.
sure.
But for all who are with us, really, thank you so much. It's been a real gift to be with you. And for those who are watching at a future time, I hope you are blessed by what we have been privy to today and been given. And I look forward to hopefully a few more reflections with our good brother and Professor Matt. So we're going to say sayonara for this night, and we'll see y'all again for our sacred holy time, our sacred time studies. And when we do this again next month with whoever we do it with, we'll do it again. And have a great week. And remember what Matt left us with: faith working through love. Love y'all.